In this lesson, we're going to take a look at percent composition. So percent composition identifies the different elements that are in a compound, and it identifies the mass as a percent of the total mass of the compound. So the way that we calculate that is we take the mass of each element and divide that by the total mass of the compound and then convert that to a percent. So for example, if I have a cup of coffee that has 95 milligrams of caffeine, which is C8H10N4O2, that caffeine is analyzed and found to contain 47 milligrams of carbon, 4.9 milligrams of hydrogen, and 27.4 milligrams of nitrogen. So what is the percent composition of each element? So essentially, what percent of the total mass of caffeine, so 95 milligrams, comes from each of the elements? So what percent of that 95 milligrams is carbon, what percent is hydrogen, what percent is nitrogen, and what percent is oxygen? So the first thing we're going to do is calculate the percent of each element by calculating the mass of the element and dividing by the mass of the compound. So there is the information that we were given. So for carbon, we have 47.0 milligrams out of the total of 95 milligrams comes from carbon. And when we calculate that, that tells us that carbon is 49.5% of the mass of caffeine. Hydrogen is 4.9 milligrams of the 95 milligrams, and that is equal to 5.16%. And then we have for nitrogen 27.4 milligrams out of 95 milligrams, and that is equal to 28.8%. So at this point we have one more element that makes up caffeine, and so we could add up all the percents we have and subtract from 100, or the other thing we can do is add up all of the masses we have and subtract that from the 95, which is the total for caffeine there. So we have 49.5, 5.16, and the other one was 28.8. So if we add all of those together, that gives us 83.46% come from those. And so our last compound there is oxygen. So oxygen is the total amount, or 100% minus 83.46%, which is 16.54% from oxygen. So the other thing we could have done was calculated the mass by subtracting the different masses, so 47, 4.9, and 27.4 from 95, and then taking the resulting amount and dividing that by 95 for oxygen. But this is quicker to do the percents. Okay, calculate percent composition of ammonium sulfate. So first thing we're going to do is calculate the molar mass. So here we're not given actual masses, but we can use the molar masses from the periodic table. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at the different elements I have. So I have aluminum, sulfur, and oxygen. I have 2 atoms of aluminum for every molecule of aluminum sulfate, and aluminum is 26.98. Sulfur is 32.07, and I have 3 sulfur. And And oxygen, there are 12 oxygens, and oxygen is 16.00. So I can calculate what each of those is going to give me. So I have 53.96 grams for 2 moles of aluminum atoms, and 96.21 grams for 3 moles of sulfur atoms, and 192 grams for 12 moles of oxygen atoms. Then I can add that total up to solve for the molar mass for aluminum sulfate. So 342.17 grams per mole of aluminum sulfate. So you'll notice that I didn't write grams per mole for each of these. So this is 53.96 grams per 2 moles of aluminum atoms, 96.21 grams per 3 moles of sulfur atoms, and 192 grams per 12 moles of oxygen atoms. Those all come together to make 1 mole of the compound aluminum sulfate. And so that's why I have the gram per mole over here. So 342.17 grams per mole. So that was for aluminum sulfate. So to calculate my percent, I am now going to take the mass of each of the elements. I'm just going to write those down from before. So aluminum was 53.96 and oxygen was 190 something. Oops. 192 and 96.21. Okay, so the 2 aluminum atoms, or moles of aluminum atoms, were 53.96 grams out of the total for aluminum sulfate, which is 342.17. So for each of these, I'm going to divide the mass of that element by the total mass of the compound. And that will give me the percent that each element accounts for the mass of the compound, so of aluminum sulfate. So that is 15.8% from aluminum, and 28.11% for sulfur, and I only did 3 significant digits for aluminum, which it should have been 4. And 56.11% for oxygen. So 15.8% of the mass of aluminum sulfate comes from aluminum, 28.11% comes from sulfur, and 56.11% of aluminum sulfate's mass comes from oxygen atoms.